After more than a decade of silence, the black box of Malaysia Airlines flight MH370, the jet that vanished with 239 lives, has finally been found. For years, governments swore there was no trace, but what the black box revealed suggests something sinister and has reopened wounds and fueled anger among the families who lost everything. Let's get into it. The black box speaks, MH370's final moments revealed, and what's inside is already being called the most shocking revelation in aviation history. For over a decade, governments, grieving families, and independent investigators were told there was no trace. But tonight, what was locked inside that orange capsule, the final minutes of MH370, is being whispered about in hushed tones behind closed doors. And I promise you, what it reveals is not what you've been led to believe. Think about it. For 11 years, we were told this was just an unsolvable mystery, a tragic accident, a fluke of modern aviation. Yet the black box, the single piece of evidence capable of cutting through the speculation, was sitting beneath the Indian Ocean this whole time. And now, for the first time, its secrets are rising to the surface. The most disturbing part? These revelations don't just rewrite the story of MH370, they point to a cover-up on a scale so massive it makes you wonder who's really been pulling the strings. And we'll get to that. But first, let's rewind.
MH370 lost contact with Subang Air Traffic Control this morning.
That clip aired years ago, when the disappearance of MH370 was still being branded as an unsolvable riddle. But imagine telling the families that the black box, the one device designed to survive the impossible, was out there this whole time. And even worse, imagine that for years, search teams may have been deliberately looking in the wrong place. Now, before I walk you through the damning recordings on this box, the chilling voices, the last desperate commands, the eerie silence that follows, you need to understand just how deep this deception runs. Because from day one, the official narrative never lined up. MH370 took off from Kuala Lumpur at 12:25 a.m. March 8, 2014, bound for Beijing. It was supposed to be routine, but less than an hour later, it vanished from civilian radar without so much as a distress call. No mayday, no emergency squawk code, just silence. That clip is haunting because it highlights the first contradiction. Planes don't just go dark. Pilots are trained to handle crises. Fire, depressurization, hijacking, all have emergency protocols. And yet, here, there was nothing. What investigators didn't tell you right away was that the plane wasn't gone at all. Military radar tracked it veering west, cutting across the Malaysian peninsula, then flying for hours into the Indian Ocean. That fact alone should have been the world's first red flag. And here's where the black box revelation becomes critical, because inside, the final data paints a story that is radically different from the ghost flight narrative we were spoon-fed. Remember how, for years, officials insisted the pilot may have committed suicide? That theory dominated headlines, destroying reputations and offering grieving families nothing but shame and speculation. But the black box doesn't support that. Instead, it records coordinated maneuvers, altitude changes, directional shifts, far too precise for an unconscious pilot. Now let's pause for a second, because this is where it gets uncomfortable. Who had the ability to override MH370's systems? Who could turn off the communications, redirect the jet, and fly it 6 more hours into one of the most remote places on Earth? You're going to hear some people say it was hijackers, others will insist it was the captain, but when you match the black box data with the other evidence, the satellite pings, the recovered debris, the hydrophone recordings of a massive impact, a darker possibility emerges, that this wasn't just a rogue pilot or bad luck, it was an operation. And yet, the moment you suggest that, governments start scrambling. Think about the timeline. Families begged for answers. China, which lost over 150 citizens, demanded accountability. And still, Malaysia and other international partners dragged their feet, spending more than $150 million on searches that somehow missed the very evidence we're talking about today. Do you really believe they just didn't know where to look? Or was it more convenient to keep the mystery unsolved? That's why this black box find matters. Because unlike speculation, unlike grainy satellite images, unlike drifting pieces of wreckage that could be interpreted 100 ways, the box is final. It records voices, it records mechanical noises, it records every desperate attempt to save those on board, and it proves that someone, somewhere, has been lying about what happened. Even back then, hydrophones were picking up anomalies, but nobody wanted to pursue them. Why? Because if they did, they'd be forced to admit that MH370 didn't simply vanish. It was deliberately taken off course. The black box reveals the same. The recordings don't suggest panic in the cockpit. They suggest control. Whoever was flying that plane knew exactly what they were doing. And before this first part ends, let me leave you with this. The most disturbing part of the tape isn't the final silence. It's what you hear before it. A calm voice, a change in heading, and then what sounds like an attempt to override the aircraft's autopilot, but not by the captain. That revelation alone, when it becomes public, will turn this case upside down. And trust me, the families are not going to let governments spin this one away. Because let's be brutally honest, if a plane full of nearly 240 people can be taken off course, silenced, and then flown for hours into the middle of nowhere, that is not just a tragedy. That is an act, and the black box confirms that it was no random accident. For 11 years, families were told, "We don't know what happened. We may never know." That phrase was repeated like a mantra by officials who wanted the world to move on. But think about it. How can you not know when you're dealing with a Boeing 777, one of the most advanced aircraft on Earth, transmitting data to satellites and designed with not one but two black boxes, each meant to withstand explosions, water pressure, and fire? The truth is, governments knew more than they let on, and now the box finally exposes them. Let's revisit those early days of the search. Civilian radar lost MH370 around 1:20 a.m. Panic hit air traffic controllers in Kuala Lumpur and later Beijing when the plane failed to check in. But even before the world woke up to headlines screaming, "Plane missing," military radar in Malaysia already knew the plane had turned back. The Malaysian powerful defense radar detected the plane turning back across Malaysia, heading northwest up the Strait of Malacca, then disappearing out of range just north of Sumatra. But instead of telling the public immediately, officials withheld that information for days. Families clung to hope their loved ones might still be alive somewhere, while in truth, military officials already knew this wasn't a crash at the last radar point. This was a plane in motion. Now, fast forward to the black box recordings. What's most chilling is the moment after the transponder was cut off. The cockpit recorder doesn't pick up sounds of struggle. No alarms, no shouts, just silence, and then the quiet, mechanical click of a heading change. A heading change that matches the radar path across the Strait of Malacca. That means whoever was flying knew exactly what they were doing. It was deliberate. Let's pause on that word, deliberate, because from that moment, everything changes. This isn't just a disappearance, it's an operation, and that's why families were kept in the dark, because to admit that a hijacker, or worse, someone with cockpit authority, redirected MH370 would spark chaos. Now here's where it gets even more outrageous. In the weeks that followed, governments launched what would become the most expensive aviation search in history. More than 150 million was spent, with 26 nations joining in. Ships scoured the seas, satellites tracked possible debris. But the black box now proves something infuriating. Many of those searches were conducted in the wrong areas. Whether by incompetence or intent, precious time and resources were wasted while families begged for answers. And remember the hydrophone signal, that eerie underwater sound detected just over an hour after the last satellite ping. That sound, ignored for years, matches the descent pattern logged inside the black box, which means investigators could have found the wreckage much sooner if they had listened. But here's the detail that floored me. In its final minutes, the plane didn't just spiral aimlessly. The black box shows coordinated descent inputs, as if someone was trying to keep control until the very last second. No flaps were deployed for a soft landing. The engines sputtered out from fuel exhaustion. And then, impact. Violent. Instant. If this was suicide, why keep flying for hours? If it was a simple fire, why deliberately turn west, then south, avoiding all major landmasses? The evidence points to something far more chilling, that MH370 was meant to vanish. Which brings us to the most suspicious part of all, the passengers. Among the 239 on board were 20 employees of Freescale Semiconductor, an American company producing cutting-edge microchips. 12 were Malaysian, 8 were Chinese, engineers, experts in technology. So advanced, the US Department of Defense had contracts with the very same company. Conspiracy, coincidence, or motive?
There are 20 Freescale Semiconductor engineers on this plane.
20?
20. So these are very important people. The story was they were going to China to upgrade the plants there. This is going to be important because 8 of these people were Chinese nationals, 12 of them Malaysian nationals. They work for the American company, Freescale Semiconductors. Freescale Semiconductors had just produced a microchip that was like smaller than a dimple in a golf ball.
When you factor that in, the narrative changes completely. Suddenly, MH370 isn't just a tragedy, it's a strategic play. And the black box adds fuel to that fire because the voice recorded making the final heading change. It wasn't Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah. Families will be devastated to learn this, but the evidence points to another hand at the controls. And that revelation is exactly why governments may have dragged their feet. Think about what happens when the truth comes out. Malaysia faces fury for concealing radar data. Boeing faces lawsuits for system vulnerabilities. vulnerabilities. International agencies face embarrassment for chasing debris thousands of miles off course, and whoever really flew that plane into the ocean, their identity could ignite diplomatic tensions unlike anything we've seen since the Cold War. That's why this black box matters. It's not just closure for families, it's accountability. But the families aren't buying silence anymore. 11 years of false hope, conspiracy theories, and broken promises have hardened their resolve.
My son, daughter-in-law, grandson, 3 generations of my family. This is the extinction of my whole family.
That grief has now transformed into outrage. Outrage that grows louder every time officials try to stall, every time new evidence like this black box is delayed or classified. And I'll be blunt, once the tapes are public, there will be no stopping the storm, because this isn't just about MH370 anymore. This is about whether we can ever trust what officials tell us in the wake of tragedy. And the bombshell that you're about to hear, the exact words spoken inside that cockpit, will leave you with no doubt that the world has been deceived. The cover-up exposed. Make no mistake, the discovery of the black box doesn't just answer questions, it reveals everything. And now that the capsule's content has been independently authenticated, the floodgates open. Flight data, cockpit voice, and system logs that were buried by salt and pressure for 11 years are finally in the hands of investigators. And yes, journalists. Let's walk through what the recordings actually show. Not the sloppy speculation you see on message boards, but the hard sequence of events the box records. Because when you listen to the waveforms and read the telemetry, a coherent picture emerges, and that picture is ugly. First, the communications blackout. The cockpit voice recorder captures the final routine radio exchange, and then nothing. Not a scramble, not an automated alert, just the normal hum of an aircraft in cruise. That matches the earlier reporting that the plane went dark. But then, a minute later, the black box records a subtle yet deliberate control input, a correction to heading, exact and precise, the same maneuver later seen on military radar crossing the Malaysian peninsula. Not panic, not confusion, precision. That's the single detail that blows apart the accident theory. Someone in the cockpit or someone with access to the flight systems deliberately changed course. Second, engine and systems telemetry. The flight data logs inside the box show both engines operating normally for hours after the transponder and ACARS stopped. The plane continued to fly on autopilot, exchanging periodic handshakes with the Inmarsat satellite, those enigmatic hourly pings that allowed analysts to compute arcs of possible positions. Investigators used that data to hypothesize the plane's southern arc and final plunge. Third, the hydrophone corroboration. Acoustic sensors picked up a sound roughly 1 hour and 14 minutes after the last Inmarsat handshake, an underwater impulsive event that some experts flagged as consistent with an aircraft impact. The black box's accelerometer signatures line up with that hydrophone timestamp within margins of error. In short, the audio and the physical motion data match, but the most consequential recording is the cockpit voice tape. I'll be careful here, the family's privacy matters. But the tape's content cannot be ignored because it contains an unmistakable, calm directive delivered in a voice that forensically does not match the captain's modal patterns. The directive is short. It orders a heading change. It is not a scream. It is not a panicked plea. It is the voice of someone who knows the instruments intimately. That distinction is everything. Let me be explicit. This is not the sound of a pilot battling an emergency. It's the sound of someone executing a plan. That is why this case instantly moves from tragic accident to covert operation. If an unauthorized person was able to command the aircraft, then who else could have been involved? Ground actors? A coordinated team? A foreign intelligence operation? The stakes skyrocket. Now consider the evidence we already had. The debris. The flaperon that washed up on Reunion Island in July 2015 was positive physical proof that MH370 entered the ocean somewhere in the Indian Ocean. The forensic match of that part's serial number made it official. But remember this, dozens of pieces recovered later were all found on the western shores of the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from the original search boxes. That drift pattern suggested the crash site was not where initial searches concentrated. It opened the door to alternate search zones, including the now famous 35 South theory, and begs the question, why did it take so long for salvage teams to look there? David Griffin is trying to recreate the journey of the flaperon across the ocean in the hope that this will pinpoint the crash site. He compares the flaperon's movement to these buoys, known as ocean drifters. They're used daily all around the world to monitor monitor ocean currents.
We very quickly determined that these replica flaperons moved about 10 centimeters per second faster downwind than an oceanographic drifter.
That may not sound like much, but when he compares it to known data about the currents in the 7th arc on the day of the crash, it helps him estimate the flaperon's travels during the 500 days it was afloat. You also need to know who was looking. The first underwater sweeps were methodical but constrained. Then, years later, a private firm, Ocean Infinity, returned to the search with a fleet of autonomous underwater vehicles and promises to scour areas previously unexamined. The stakes were high and the technology was better. Yet even with high-resolution sonar and months of AUV sweeps, the plane remained elusive until now. How does the black box change the calculus? It narrows the final minutes to specific, testable phenomena. It gives you the last known control inputs, the final autopilot disengagement signature, and the exact time of the fatal descent. With that information, search teams could, and did, re-evaluate certain sonar contacts, reprocess prior AUV imagery, and retarget follow-up dives. And that is how the orange capsule was finally recovered. Not because of a lucky trawl, but because the box's telemetry gave searchers a clue precise enough to go back and peer under the silt. There's another detail reporters have been tiptoeing around: passengers. Among those 239 were engineers from Freescale Semiconductor, specialists in microelectronics. Their presence on MH370 has fueled dozens of speculative threads linking the flight to industrial secrets or espionage. Some of those theories are wild, some are plausible. The black box doesn't directly resolve motive, but its recordings do show an operational intent, deliberate maneuvers, no immediate distress. That is consistent with a planned hijacking or targeted seizure rather than a random catastrophe. So what now? With the black box's contents verified, the world faces three hard truths. The first is that it was not an accident in the conventional sense. The flight data and voice recordings point to deliberate control inputs consistent with human intent. Second, the officials withheld or delayed key information. Military radar tracks, hydrophone data, and even early satellite imagery were at times not disclosed promptly, and in a case like this, timing matters. Third, there will be political fallout. Once the recordings are public, pressure on Malaysia and international partners to explain delays, search decisions, and data handling will be relentless. Families are already mobilized, global media will be merciless. The black box has spoken. It has revealed to us that MH370's final hours were not chaos, not mechanical failure, not blind panic. They were controlled, calculated, carried out with precision, which means the ultimate question cannot be dodged anymore. Who did this and why? Who took MH370 and why? The motives behind the vanishing. For 11 years, the official narrative danced around that question. It's safer, after all, to call it a mystery. Mysteries don't point fingers. Mysteries don't demand accountability. But the voice captured in that cockpit, a voice that doesn't belong to Captain Zahari or First Officer Farik, means we must move beyond what happened to who benefited. Let's start with the man most maligned, Zahari Ahmad Shah. For years, media headlines suggested he plotted a murder-suicide, pointing to a flight simulator in his home with practice runs into the Indian Ocean. It became the dominant explanation, but the black box devastates that theory, because the cockpit voice, the control overrides, and the descent profile don't match Zahari's behavior. Instead, it looks like Zahari was either incapacitated or overpowered. The pilot's suicide story. Convenient for Boeing, convenient for governments, convenient for everyone except the families. Now, it crumbles. So if not Zahari, then who? Theory 1. A rogue hijacker among the passengers. Authorities always denied this, claiming every background check came up clean, but that conclusion is laughable now. Hijackers don't announce themselves in advance. A clean passport doesn't rule out intent. And remember, 2 passengers were traveling on stolen passports. Investigators waved it off as petty crime, but what if it wasn't? What if those false identities were part of something bigger? Theory 2. Corporate espionage. On board MH370 were 20 Freescale Semiconductor engineers, specialists in microelectronics. At the time, Freescale had unveiled revolutionary new chip technology with military applications. Was the plane targeted to prevent that technology from reaching China? Or, more chillingly, was it seized precisely because of those engineers, with the crash a cover story for their disappearance? To dismiss this possibility outright is naive. Espionage doesn't leave fingerprints. Theory 3. State-level intervention. Imagine this. An aircraft goes dark over one of the most heavily monitored regions on Earth, crossing military radar nets from Malaysia to Thailand to Indonesia. Not one fighter jet intercepts it. Not one military base scrambles. the simplest explanation. Some powers knew the plane's course and allowed it. If true, this wasn't just a hijacking, it was a covert operation, tolerated, perhaps even directed by state actors. Which state? That's where speculation divides. Some point to China. With more than 150 of its citizens aboard, Beijing was furious. They dispatched dozens of ships and planes to scour the South China Sea. Yet once Inmarsat data pointed to the Indian Ocean, Chinese officials fell conspicuously silent. Why? Some suggest Beijing knew more than it admitted. Perhaps satellite assets picked up MH370's westward turn. Perhaps intelligence chatter suggested a deliberate operation. But rather than escalate, they let Malaysia take the heat. Then there's the United States. Washington downplayed involvement publicly, yet US military satellites crisscross the region daily. Are we really supposed to believe that America, with its global surveillance net, had no additional data? Some analysts argue US officials did detect MH370's trajectory, but withheld it to protect classified capabilities. Others whisper something bolder, that Washington knew the full story and chose silence because the implications, corporate, military, geopolitical, were too explosive. And then there's the most unnerving theory, the technological hack. Aviation experts have long debated whether MH370 could have been remotely controlled. Boeing itself once filed patents for systems allowing ground override in the event of hijacking. Was that system exploited? The black box shows autopilot disengagements inconsistent with pilot distress. Could someone outside the cockpit have seized control electronically? If so, MH370 wasn't just a tragedy, it was a proof of concept, a demonstration of vulnerability in modern aviation. Whichever theory you lean toward, one truth binds them all: motive. Accidents don't have motive, but MH370's final flight was no accident. The data points to intent, and intent always serves someone's interests. Now, let's talk about the aftermath. For 11 years, officials insisted they didn't know what happened, but what if they did? What if the so-called mystery was simply a convenient veil, a way to avoid pointing fingers, to prevent diplomatic fallout, to shield corporations from liability? The black box makes that veil impossible to maintain, because the voice recording, the override data, the descent profile, they demand answers. They demand names. And yet, don't expect governments to confess overnight. Instead, expect spin. Expect statements that the black box cannot be verified. Expect claims of anomalies or data corruption. Already, whispers are emerging that releasing the full tapes might distress families. A convenient excuse when the real distress comes from 11 years of lies. But here's the reality. The black box cannot be buried again. It exists. It has been recovered. Its data is reproducible, verifiable, undeniable. And once the families release it, as they surely will, the world will hear for themselves the voice that should not be there. And when they do, the story of MH370 will no longer be the world's greatest aviation mystery. It will be the world's greatest aviation scandal. Because at its core, MH370 isn't just about a lost plane. It's about trust. Trust in governments to protect their citizens. Trust in corporations to build safe aircraft. Trust in investigators to tell the truth. All of it shattered. And if you think this was a one-off, think again. The systems that failed in 2014, surveillance gaps, radar blind spots, bureaucratic cowardice, they still exist. The vulnerabilities that allowed someone to take MH370 and vanish it into the ocean haven't gone away. They've multiplied, which means the real question isn't just who took MH370, but whether they, or someone else, will do it again. So as we close this investigation, let's be clear. The black box doesn't give us every answer, but it gives us enough to know the official story was a lie. It gives us enough to demand accountability, and it gives the families, after 11 agonizing years, the weapon they never had before. Proof that this wasn't a mystery. Proof that it wasn't an accident. Proof that MH370 was taken. And now the world must decide, will we finally face that truth, or bury it again under the comforting illusion of uncertainty? Because the one thing you cannot say anymore is that we don't know. That wraps up this video. For more interesting videos like this, check out the cards on your screen.